My daughter-in-law just made the biggest mistake of her life. An hour ago, I received a text message that read, "I borrowed your old ring for the party, Grandma. Hope you don't mind." I replied with a smile, "Have fun, dear." But immediately afterward, I dialed my lawyer, Frank Miller, and told him, "File a report for the theft of inventory item 847, a $3 million pink diamond ring." An hour later, the police raided that elegant party where Cynthia was flaunting my ring, believing she had taken a worthless trinket. If you're watching this, subscribe and tell me where you're from, because this story is going to leave you speechless. My name is Dolores. I am 71 years old, and for the past 10 years, I've been treated like the invisible mother-in-law, the old lady who gets in the way at family gatherings. To Cynthia, I was nothing more than an annoying old woman living in the house my late husband left me. She joined our family a decade ago when she married my son Louis, and from day one, she made me feel like an intruder in my own home. Cynthia is one of those women who believe the world owes them everything. Elegant, manipulative, always dressed in the finest red and green gowns, adorned with expensive jewelry that my son bought her to keep her happy. From the moment she stepped into my home, she began treating me as if I were her personal maid. "Dolores, make me a coffee." "Dolores, iron my black dress for tonight." "Dolores, don't make noise when you walk, my head hurts." She never addressed me with respect. To her, I was simply the old lady, as if I didn't even have a name. At family dinners, she would talk about me as if I weren't present. "Louis, your mother should consider moving to a retirement home. This house is too big for someone her age." And my son, my own son, would just lower his head and mumble, "Mom is fine here, Cynthia." But I knew things were changing. Louis began to look at me differently, as if I were a burden. Cynthia had slowly poisoned his mind, whispering in his ear that I was too old to care for such a large house, that they needed the space for their own plans. She had grand dreams, to turn my living room into her personal office, to transform the garden my husband and I had cultivated for 40 years into a modern entertainment area. For years, I endured her humiliations in silence. When guests arrived, Cynthia would introduce me as Louis's mother, never as the owner of the house. When she hosted parties, I had to hide in my room because, according to her, old people make others uncomfortable. There were nights I cried in silence, wondering how I had become invisible in the home I built with so much love. What Cynthia never knew, what no one in my family knew, was that my late husband, Mario, left me much more than this house. During our last years together, Mario had been secretly collecting valuable art, jewelry, and antiques. He knew I was discreet, that I never flaunted wealth, and he trusted that I would know how to handle his legacy when the time came. In a secret safe hidden behind a painting in my bedroom, he kept a collection worth over $15 million. Among those pieces was the ring Cynthia had just borrowed, a 5-carat pink diamond ring designed by a French jeweler in 1920, valued at $3 million. To anyone unfamiliar with jewelry, it might have looked like a simply elegant antique ring, but to experts, it was a masterpiece. Today, Cynthia had an important charity gala, one of those elegant gatherings where business wives display their finest attire and compete to see who has the most impressive jewels. For weeks, I had heard her complain that she didn't have the perfect accessory for her golden dress. She had been poring over jewelry catalogs, sighing because the pieces she liked cost too much, even for the generous budget Louis gave her. This morning, as I watered the garden plants, I saw her enter my room without permission. It wasn't the first time she had snooped through my things, but this time was different. I watched her open my jewelry box, that small wooden chest where I keep some less valuable pieces, and her eyes landed on the pink diamond ring. She took it, examined it against the light, and I saw that disdainful smile she always wore when she believed she had found something she could use. An hour later, I received that text message. "I borrowed your old ring for the party, Grandma. Hope you don't mind." She didn't even have the courtesy to ask for my permission first. She just took it, assuming everything of mine was at her disposal, that I was too old and insignificant to possess anything of real value. When I read that message, something inside me changed. For 10 years, I had endured her humiliations, her contempt, her cruel remarks about my age and my supposed uselessness. But taking my ring without permission, that ring, which represented one of the most valuable pieces in Mario's secret collection, was the last straw. I sat in my garden chair, looking at the message on my phone, and for the first time in years, I genuinely smiled. "Have fun, dear," I replied, but immediately afterward, I dialed Frank, my trusted lawyer. Frank had been Mario's best friend, the only one who knew the full truth about our hidden fortune. "Frank," I said with a voice firmer than I had used in years, "it's time to activate the protocol you and Mario designed. Cynthia just stole inventory item 847. There was a silence on the other end of the line, and then I heard Frank's laugh. "Dolores, are you absolutely sure you want to do this? Once we put this in motion, there will be no turning back." I confirmed that yes, after a decade of humiliations, it was time for my daughter-in-law to learn exactly who she was dealing with. Frank explained the plan. For years, he had been documenting each piece of Mario's collection, officially registering them as high-value items with specific inventory numbers. Each piece had certificates of authenticity, updated appraisals, and most importantly, full insurance coverage. The ring Cynthia had taken was legally registered as item 847, valued at $3 million. "I'm going to call the insurance company immediately," Frank told me. "The protocol states that when a registered piece is taken without the owner's authorization, we must report it as theft immediately. In 30 minutes, the police will have a warrant to recover the stolen property, no matter where it is." While Frank made the necessary calls, I sat in my living room and recalled all the times Cynthia had made me feel invisible. The time she hosted a dinner for Louis's business partners and told me to eat in the kitchen because there wasn't enough space in the dining room. Last Christmas, when she opened expensive gifts Louis had bought her and then handed me a cheap scarf saying, "We got you something simple because at your age, you don't need many things anymore." I remembered the day her friends came over for a book club meeting. I was reading in my favorite armchair in the living room when she came in and told me in front of everyone, "Dolores, could you go to your room? We need privacy to talk about important things." Her friends looked at me with pity, as if I were an old pet that needed to be moved out of the way. But what hurt me most to remember was the conversation I had overheard last week. Cynthia was talking on the phone with her sister Gretchen, and I could hear everything from the hallway. "I swear this old woman is driving me crazy," she said. "She lives in this huge house like a queen, but look at how she dresses. Look at her cheap jewelry. It's pathetic. Louis and I are waiting for her to decide to move to a retirement home, but she's too stubborn. When she finally leaves, I'm going to renovate this entire house, starting by throwing all her ugly antiques in the trash." That conversation had been the moment I decided I couldn't stay silent anymore. Cynthia not only despised me, she also despised everything Mario and I had built together. She had no idea that those ugly antiques she hated so much were worth more money than she could earn in several lifetimes. Frank called me back. "Everything's ready, Dolores. The theft report has been officially filed. The ring is listed as stolen property valued at $3 million. I gave the police the address of the hotel where the charity gala is being held. They have orders to recover the stolen property immediately." "And what will happen to Cynthia?" I asked. Frank sighed. "Dolores, technically, she has committed grand larceny. We're talking about $3 million. According to the law, she could face several years in prison, but you are the victim, so you can decide if you want to press criminal charges or simply recover your property." I told him I wanted to think about it. For now, I just wanted to see Cynthia's face when she realized she had completely underestimated the useless old lady she despised so much. An hour after I filed the report, my phone rang. It was Louis, and he sounded absolutely panicked. "Mom, what's going on? The police just raided Cynthia's party. They say she stole a $3 million ring. This has to be a terrible mistake." "It's not a mistake, son," I replied calmly. "Your wife took a very valuable piece from your father's collection without permission. That ring is worth exactly $3 million, and she had no right to take it." "What collection? What are you talking about? Dad never had anything worth $3 million. Mom, you have to call the police and tell them it was a misunderstanding. It was unbelievable. My own son didn't even know the truth about the fortune his father had accumulated. Mario had been very careful to keep his investments and collections secret, even from Louis. He wanted to protect our family from the dangers that come with visible wealth, kidnappers, con artists, distant relatives who appear asking for money. Louis, I said, there are many things you don't know about your father and about me. Your wife has just made a very serious mistake, and she will face the consequences alone. Mom, have you gone crazy? Cynthia is crying. They're treating her like a criminal. Her friends are recording everything with their phones. Her reputation is ruined. Her reputation, I repeated. What about the 10 years I've endured her treating me like trash in my own home? What about all the times she humiliated me in front of people? What about that conversation where she told her sister I was pathetic? Louis fell silent. He knew exactly what conversation I was talking about because he had heard it too and had done nothing to defend me. Mom, please, he finally mumbled. Cynthia can be difficult sometimes, but she doesn't deserve to go to jail for a misunderstanding. It wasn't a misunderstanding, Louis. It was theft. And now your wife is going to learn that the woman she despised so much is not the helpless old lady she thought. I hung up the phone and sat in silence, processing what had just happened. My son, my own son, had spent 10 years watching his wife humiliate me and had never raised his voice to defend me. Now that the consequences had arrived, he wanted me to be the one to save Cynthia from her own arrogance. But I wasn't going to do it. For the first time in a decade, I wasn't going to be the invisible woman who endured everything in silence. 20 minutes later, Frank arrived at my house accompanied by Patrick, a private detective he had worked with for years. Patrick was a man in his 50s, elegant and professional, specializing in fraud and art theft cases. Dolores, Frank told me, Patrick has been discreetly investigating Cynthia for the past 6 months, ever since you mentioned your suspicion about her activities. I was surprised. What suspicions? I never told you I suspected Cynthia. Frank smiled. Do you remember the conversation we had in December when you mentioned that some of your small pieces had been moved, and that you had noticed your jewelry box had been moved several times? Yes, I remembered. I had thought it was my imagination, the forgetfulness of old age. Those weren't oversights, Dolores. I decided to investigate discreetly, and what Patrick discovered goes far beyond today's ring. Patrick opened a folder full of photographs and documents. Mrs. Dolores, your daughter-in-law has been selling pieces from your collection for almost 2 years. Small things at first, antique brooches, pearl earrings, a silver necklace, things you might have thought you had lost or put elsewhere. My heart raced. We have documented at least 12 different sales at pawn shops and antique stores in the city. The total value of what she has sold amounts to approximately $45,000. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Cynthia not only humiliated me and treated me as if I were invisible, she had also been stealing from me for years. But how? How did she know which pieces to take without me realizing it? She's clever, Patrick continued. She only took pieces that you rarely wore or that were stored at the bottom of your drawers. Apparently, she had been mentally cataloging all your jewelry for years, identifying which ones she could take without you immediately noticing their absence. Furthermore, we have evidence that she has been taking photographs of all your valuable belongings, probably to assess what else she could sell in the future. Frank added, Patrick has recordings of Cynthia at 3 different pawn shops, where she clearly lies about the origin of the jewelry. In one recording, she says they are heirlooms from her deceased grandmother. In another, she claims her husband gave them to her, but that she needs quick cash for a medical emergency. I felt a mixture of fury and betrayal I had never experienced before. For 2 years, while I felt guilty for losing my things, while I thought my memory was failing me, Cynthia had been systematically stealing from me and then lying to sell my belongings. Worse still, she had been planning to steal from me more extensively, secretly photographing my collection. There's more, said Patrick, turning to the next page of the file. Her spending patterns do not match the income she and your son officially have. In the last 2 years, Cynthia has bought over $30,000 worth of clothing, paid for expensive treatments, luxurious vacations, and has been frequenting high-end restaurants. When we confronted these expenses with the money we know she obtained by selling your jewelry, the numbers match perfectly. So the money Cynthia had used to buy all those elegant red and green dresses, those designer handbags with which she looked at me with superiority, those expensive shoes she used to trample my self-esteem, it had all come from the sale of my belongings. She had been funding her luxurious lifestyle by stealing from me, the useless old woman she despised so much. But wait, I said, if you knew all this for months, why didn't you tell me anything? Frank exchanged a look with Patrick. Dolores, we needed enough evidence to build a solid case. Also, we wanted to wait until she made a mistake big enough that she couldn't deny it or manipulate the situation. Today's theft of the $3 million ring is exactly that mistake. At that moment, my phone rang again. It was an unknown number, but I answered. Mrs. Dolores? It was a woman's voice I didn't recognize. She sounded nervous. This is Detective Margaret Garcia from the Metropolitan Police. We're at the Plaza Hotel with your daughter-in-law, Cynthia. She's insisting that you gave her permission to take the ring and that this is all a misunderstanding. Could you come to the hotel to clarify the situation? Detective Garcia, I replied. My daughter-in-law took that ring without my permission. I have the text message where she herself admits she borrowed it without asking for prior authorization. Furthermore, that ring is valued at $3 million and is part of a legally registered collection. I understand, ma'am, but your daughter-in-law is very upset, and your son is also here, insisting there must be some misunderstanding. He says you've never owned such valuable jewelry and that there's probably an error in the appraisal. I laughed, a laugh that surprised even Frank and Patrick. Detective, my son is saying I couldn't possibly have valuable jewelry because I'm too poor or too foolish to possess such a thing? There was an awkward silence on the other end of the line. Well, ma'am, he did mention that you live on a modest pension and had never shown signs of that kind of wealth. Detective Garcia, I'll be there in an hour, and I'll bring my lawyer and all the documents that prove not only that the ring is mine, but also that my daughter-in-law has been stealing from me for years. I expect that when I arrive, she will be in police custody, as befits a thief who has stolen property valued at over $3 million. After hanging up, I looked at Frank and Patrick. Gentlemen, it's time for Cynthia and my son to learn exactly who they've been dealing with all these years. Frank smiled. Dolores, is there anything else I should know before we go to the hotel? Patrick discovered that Cynthia has been talking to an art appraiser named Mark, showing him photographs of several pieces from your collection. Apparently, she was planning a much larger theft. According to our recordings, she believed she could sell several of your paintings and sculptures for at least $200,000. Patrick added, Mrs. Dolores, your daughter-in-law not only sees you as a useless old woman, she sees you as a source of income she can exploit without consequences. In her own recorded words during a phone conversation with that appraiser, she said, The old lady doesn't even know what she has. I could steal half her stuff and she'd never realize it. She's too senile to keep an inventory of her belongings. Those words were like a slap in the face. Cynthia had not only been stealing from me, she had been laughing at me, considering me too stupid and useless to realize her crimes. She had been planning to rob me massively, taking advantage of what she perceived as my senility. Frank, I said, getting up from my chair with a determination I hadn't felt in years, I want you to press every possible charge against Cynthia, not only for today's ring, but for all the thefts over the past 2 years. And I want my son, Louis, to know exactly what kind of woman he chose as his wife. Are you absolutely sure, Dolores? Once we make this public, the entire family will know the truth about Mario's fortune and about Cynthia's crimes. There will be no way to go back. I looked out the window at the garden Mario and I had cultivated for 40 years, the garden Cynthia wanted to destroy to be her modern entertainment area. I thought of all the humiliations I had endured, all the times I had felt invisible in my own home, all the nights I had cried, wondering if I really was as useless as Cynthia made me feel. "Frank," I said, "it's time for this senile old woman to teach them a lesson they will never forget." When we arrived at the Plaza Hotel, the scene was exactly as I had imagined. There were at least 5 police cruisers at the entrance, local reporters who had arrived drawn by the drama, and groups of charity gala guests leaving the hotel, whispering and pointing. This was the kind of scandal that our city's high society would remember for years. As I entered the lobby, I immediately saw Cynthia. She was sitting on a leather sofa surrounded by 3 police officers, and for the first time in 10 years, she didn't look like the elegant, controlled woman she had always been. Her perfect makeup was streaked with tears. Her golden dress was wrinkled, and her hands were handcuffed in front of her. The ring, my $3 million ring, was no longer on her finger. Louis stood beside her, gesticulating violently as he spoke with a detective. When he saw me enter, accompanied by Frank and Patrick, his expression changed from desperation to something that looked more like fury. He walked quickly toward me, and I could see in his eyes that he blamed me, not his thieving wife, for this entire situation. "Mom, you have to fix this right now," he yelled at me in front of the entire crowded lobby. "Cynthia is being publicly humiliated because of you. Her friends are uploading videos to social media. Her reputation is completely ruined." "Her reputation?" I repeated, keeping my voice calm even though I was trembling with rage inside. "Louis, your wife stole a $3 million ring from me. We're not talking about a misunderstanding over a trinket. We're talking about a serious crime. But Mom, you never told us you had anything so valuable. If we had known, this never would have happened." Cynthia thought it was just some old, worthless ring. Frank stepped forward and handed Louis a thick folder. "Mr. Louis, here are all the documents proving the value of the ring, along with certificates of authenticity and insurance policies. Your wife did not steal a worthless old ring. She stole a historical piece of jewelry valued at $3 million. Louis opened the folder and began to review the documents. I watched as his expression gradually changed from disbelief to complete shock. This can't be real. Dad really had these things? Why did you never tell us anything?" "Because your father knew it was better to keep our wealth private," I explained. "And seeing how your wife has been stealing from me for 2 years, it seems he was right." "Stealing from you for 2 years? What are you talking about?" Patrick stepped forward and showed Louis the complete file on Cynthia, the photographs of her at the pawn shops, the recordings where she lied about the origin of my jewelry, the sales receipts. Everything was there. "Your wife, Mr. Louis, has been systematically selling your mother's belongings for the past 2 years. We have documented thefts totaling $45,000. Louis was speechless as he reviewed the evidence. I could see his world crumbling before his eyes. The woman he had married, the woman for whom he had allowed me to be treated like trash for a decade, was a thief who had been exploiting his own mother. At that moment, Detective Garcia approached us. "Mrs. Dolores, I need you to officially confirm some details. Did you give your daughter-in-law permission to take the ring in question?" "Absolutely not," I replied firmly. "I have the text message here where she herself admits she borrowed it without asking my permission. In my world, taking something without permission is called theft." "And can you confirm that the ring legally belongs to you?" Frank intervened. "Detective, here are all the legal documents. The ring was purchased by Mrs. Dolores's late husband in 1975. It is registered in his will, it is insured for its full value, and it is part of the official inventory of the inheritance Mrs. Dolores received." The detective reviewed the documents and nodded. "Everything seems to be in order. Mrs. Dolores, do you wish to press criminal charges against your daughter-in-law?" Before I could answer, Cynthia cried out from her seat. "Dolores, please, it was just a misunderstanding. You know I would never intentionally hurt you. I've always treated you with respect." I turned to her slowly. For the first time in 10 years, Cynthia was speaking to me with desperation instead of contempt. For the first time, she needed me instead of treating me as if I were invisible. Respect? I asked, walking toward where she was sitting. Do you call 10 years of humiliations respect? Do you call telling me to eat in the kitchen when guests arrived respect? Do you call stealing from me for 2 years and then calling me senile respect? Her eyes filled with panic. Steal from you? I never stole anything from you. This is the first time I've taken something of yours. Patrick stepped closer and showed her the photographs of her at the pawn shops. Mrs. Cynthia, we have photographic and video evidence of you selling your mother-in-law's belongings on at least 12 different occasions over the past 2 years. Cynthia's face turned completely pale. She looked at the photographs, then at me, then at Louis, desperately searching for an explanation that could save her. Those were just small pieces that I thought you didn't use anymore, she mumbled. I never thought you'd notice. I thought you had forgotten them. And that gave you the right to steal them? I asked. And to lie in the pawn shops, saying they were heirlooms from your grandmother? Louis looked at her in horror. Cynthia, did you really do that? Did you really steal my mother's things for years? Cynthia began to cry harder. Louis, you know how much we needed the extra money. You know your salary wasn't enough for the lifestyle we wanted, and she has so many things. I thought she would never notice a few small pieces missing. But they weren't yours to take, Louis shouted. They were my mother's, and you made me believe she was losing her memory when she asked about her things. It was then that I realized what had really been happening. Cynthia had not only been stealing from me, she had been manipulating Louis into believing I was developing dementia. Every time I mentioned I couldn't find something, she would whisper to Louis that it was normal for elderly people to lose their things and forget where they had put them. Detective Garcia, I said, feeling a strange and powerful calm, I want to press every possible charge against my daughter-in-law, not only for today's ring, but for all the thefts she has committed over the past 2 years. No, cried Cynthia. Please, Dolores, I can give you everything back. I can compensate you. Don't do this to me. I looked her directly in the eyes. Cynthia, for 10 years you treated me as if I were invisible. You humiliated me in front of guests. You made me feel like a useless burden in my own home. For 2 years, you stole from me while making me believe I was losing my memory. And now that the consequences have arrived, you want me to have mercy on you? But I never thought it was so serious. I never thought you had such valuable things. If I had known I had valuable things, what? Would you have stolen more from me? I let her process that question for a moment. Cynthia, the problem isn't that you didn't know the value of what you stole. The problem is that you stole from me. The problem is that for a decade you treated me like trash. Frank approached the detective. Detective Garcia, we also want to file charges for the other documented thefts. We have enough evidence to prosecute at least 12 additional cases of theft. The detective nodded. Understood. Mrs. Cynthia, you are under arrest for grand larceny in the first degree, multiple counts of petty theft, and fraud. You have the right to remain silent. As the detective read Cynthia her Miranda rights, I looked at my son Louis. He stood there watching his wife being officially arrested, finally understanding that the woman he had married was a criminal who had been exploiting his own mother for years. Mom, he said in a broken voice, I didn't know any of this. You have to believe me. Louis, I replied. Perhaps you didn't know about the thefts, but you did know how Cynthia treated me. You saw every humiliation, every slight, every moment she made me feel invisible in my own home, and you never said anything. Louis lowered his head, unable to look me in the eyes. He knew I was right. For 10 years, he had been a silent witness to his wife, turning me into a stranger in my own home, and he had chosen the easy path to say nothing, not to confront, not to defend his own mother. Now that the truth had come to light, he finally understood the price of his silence. Mom, he mumbled, I thought you two would eventually find a way to get along. I thought if I didn't get involved, things would resolve themselves. Things don't resolve themselves, Louis, I replied, especially when one person is systematically abusing another. Your wife not only disrespected me for a decade, she stole from me, manipulated me, and planned to steal even more. And you thought that would just resolve itself? As I spoke with Louis, I could see that several guests from the charity gala were recording the scene with their phones. The story of the millionaire mother-in-law who caught her thieving daughter-in-law would be circulating on social media before the night was over. For Cynthia, who had built her entire social identity around her image as an elegant and respectable wife, this was worse than jail. Detective Garcia finished reading the Miranda rights and began to escort Cynthia toward the exit. But before they could reach the door, Cynthia turned to me with an expression I had never seen before. Pure, desperate fury. "Dolores, you don't understand what you've just done!" she screamed at me. "My life is ruined, my friends, my reputation, everything is destroyed. And why? For a stupid ring you didn't even wear." "No," I calmly replied. "For 10 years of thefts, humiliations, and mistreatment, today's ring was simply the last straw. But I gave you a family," she continued to scream. "I gave you grandchildren you never had. Louis and I gave you a purpose in your old age." That was the most ridiculous statement I had heard in years. "Cynthia, you didn't give me a family. You turned my family into strangers who treated me as if I were a burden. And as for grandchildren, you two decided not to have children, remember? You said children would ruin your figure and interfere with your career." Louis looked increasingly uncomfortable with every word that came out of his wife's mouth. I think he was finally seeing Cynthia as she really was. Manipulative, selfish, and completely willing to lie when the consequences of her actions finally caught up to her. "Dolores!" Cynthia yelled as the detective tried to make her walk. "If you go through with this, you're going to lose your son forever. Louis will never forgive you for destroying his marriage." I looked at Louis. He stood there, watching his wife make threats while she was being arrested for stealing from his own mother. "Louis," I said, "is that how you feel? Do you think I destroyed your marriage?" Louis remained silent for a long moment, processing everything he had discovered in the last 2 hours. His wife was not the elegant and sophisticated woman he thought he had won over. She was a thief who had been exploiting his elderly mother for years, while manipulating him into believing that his mother's forgetfulness was a sign of senility. "No, Mom," he finally said. "My marriage was destroyed the moment Cynthia decided to steal from you for the first time. I just didn't realize it until now." Cynthia was speechless for the first time. She had been counting on Louis to blame me for her problems, as he had done so many times before. But this time, the evidence was too clear and the lies too obvious. After Cynthia was taken away, Patrick handed me an additional folder. "Mrs. Dolores, there's something else you need to know. During our investigation, we discovered that Cynthia had been in contact with an attorney specializing in wills and inheritances. Apparently, she had been researching legal ways to challenge your father-in-law's will if you were to pass away." Louis looked increasingly sick. "What does that mean?" "It means," Frank explained, "that your wife was not only stealing from his mother in the present. She was planning for the future, investigating how to take over the entire inheritance when his mother died." Patrick added, "We found emails between Cynthia and this lawyer discussing the possibility of declaring your mother mentally incompetent. The plan was to demonstrate that you had senile dementia and therefore lacked the legal capacity to manage your finances or property." My blood ran cold. She was planning to declare me mentally incompetent. "Yes," Patrick continued. "In one of the emails, Cynthia mentions that you had been frequently losing things and that this could be used as evidence of mental decline. Of course, now we know that you weren't losing things. She was stealing them." Louis sat heavily in a lobby chair. "My God," he mumbled. She was planning to steal everything from you." "Not only that," Frank added, "we also found that she had been pressuring Louis to convince you to move to a retirement home. Once you were institutionalized, it would have been much easier to obtain a court order declaring you mentally incompetent." I remembered all the conversations where Cynthia subtly suggested that I was too old to live alone, that I needed professional care, that I would be happier in a place designed for people my age. It wasn't genuine concern. It was a calculated strategy to seize my fortune. "Mrs. Dolores," Patrick said, Your daughter-in-law is much more dangerous than we initially thought. We're not talking about a woman who impulsively took some jewelry. We're talking about someone who had developed a long-term plan to steal your entire inheritance and declare you mentally incompetent to legally justify it." Louis lifted his head and looked at me with tears in his eyes. "Mom, I never suspected any of this. When Cynthia mentioned the retirement home, I thought it was because she genuinely cared about your well-being." "Louis," I said, sitting next to him, "your wife manipulated you as much as she manipulated me. She knew exactly what to say to make you believe her intentions were good." Frank closed his folder and looked at me seriously. "Dolores, with all this evidence, the district attorney is probably going to offer Cynthia a plea bargain. Depending on how we handle this, she could face between 5 and 15 years in prison." "And what about the money she already stole?" I asked. "Most of the pieces she sold were bought by private collectors," Patrick explained. "We're going to be able to track down and recover approximately 60% of the stolen value. The rest was probably already spent on her lavish lifestyle." Louis sighed deeply. "Mom, what's going to happen now? What's going to happen to me? What's going to happen to our family?" It was a good question. In the space of 2 hours, my family had been completely transformed. My daughter-in-law was arrested and facing years in prison. My son finally understood that he had been married to a criminal who planned to steal everything from me, and I, the senile old woman who had been invisible for 10 years, was suddenly the center of attention. "Louis," I said, taking his hand, "what's going to happen now is that you're going to have to decide what kind of man you want to be. For 10 years, you were a silent accomplice to your wife's mistreatment of me. Now you know the truth about who she really is. The question is, what are you going to do with that information?" "Mom, I want to make things right with you. I want to make amends for all the years I didn't defend you." "Making amends isn't about money, Louis. It's about respect. It's about never again allowing anyone to treat me as if I were invisible in my own home." Louis nodded. I can stay with you tonight. I don't want to be alone at home after all this." For the first time in 10 years, my son was asking something of me instead of demanding that I adapt to his wife's needs. "Of course you can stay, Louis, but tomorrow we need to talk seriously about how we are going to rebuild our relationship." As we left the hotel, I could see that the story was already appearing on local news. "Millionaire elderly woman catches thieving daughter-in-law with $3 million ring." By tomorrow, the entire city would know that Dolores, the invisible old woman, had turned out to be a woman with more power than anyone had imagined. The next day, I woke up feeling different. For the first time in 10 years, I woke up in my own house without feeling like an intruder in my own home. Louis had slept in his old room, and when I went down for breakfast, I found him in the kitchen making coffee. It was the first time in a decade that someone had made something for me in my own kitchen, instead of expecting me to serve everyone else. "Good morning, Mom," he said. And there was something different in his voice. Respect. A silent apology in every word. "Good morning, son." I sat at the table where I had had breakfast with Mario for 40 years, the table where Cynthia had made me feel like an unwelcome guest for so long. Louis placed a cup of coffee in front of me and sat on the other side. "Mom, I couldn't sleep last night. I was thinking about all the times Cynthia treated you badly, and I didn't say anything. I was remembering all the times you mentioned you couldn't find something, and I thought it was your memory." "Louis," I interrupted softly, "you don't need to punish yourself for being manipulated. Cynthia is very intelligent. She knew exactly how to present things to make it seem like she cared about my well-being while she was stealing from me. But I'm your son. I should have been on your side. I should have seen the signs." I took a sip of coffee and looked directly at him. "What matters now is what you're going to do in the future. The question is, are you going to try to save your marriage with a woman who planned to steal everything from me and declare me mentally incompetent?" Louis fell silent for a long moment. I could see the internal struggle on his face. He had been married to Cynthia for 10 years. Despite everything he had discovered, she was still his wife. At that moment, the phone rang. It was Frank. "Dolores, I have important news. The district attorney wants to meet with you this morning. Apparently, Cynthia's case is bigger than we initially thought." "Bigger how?" "They searched her house last night and found a secret room in the basement. Dolores, your daughter-in-law wasn't just stealing from you. She's been running an antique theft and resale operation that involves several wealthy families in the city." My heart raced. "What do you mean?" "They found more than 50 pieces of art and jewelry that belong neither to her nor to Louis. Apparently, she's been using her access to high society social events to identify targets and then organizing more elaborate thefts. Your house wasn't her only target. It was her base of operations." Louis turned pale. "Are you saying that our house has been the center of a criminal operation for years?" Frank continued. "There's more. They found correspondence indicating that Cynthia had been selling information to professional thieves. House plans, family schedules, information about security systems. The FBI is now involved because apparently this operation crosses state lines." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The woman who had shared my table for 10 years, who had slept under my roof, who had eaten my food, had not only been stealing from me, she had been running a criminal enterprise from my own home. "Frank, what does this mean for Louis? Can he be considered an accomplice?" "The FBI will want to question him, of course. But so far, all the evidence suggests that Louis had no knowledge of his wife's criminal activities. She was very careful to keep him away from her operation." After hanging up, Louis and I sat in silence. My house, the home Mario and I had built with so much love, had been violated in ways I was only beginning to understand. "Mom," Louis finally said, "how is it possible that I was married to a criminal for 10 years and never realized it?" "Because she wanted you not to realize it," I replied. "Louis, people like Cynthia are experts at compartmentalizing their lives. To you, she was the elegant wife who accompanied you to social events. To me, she was the daughter-in-law who constantly humiliated me. To her victims, she was the thief who planned robberies. She kept every aspect of her life completely separate." An hour later, Frank arrived, accompanied by 2 FBI agents. Agent Karen Brooks and Agent Michael Smith introduced themselves and explained that Cynthia's case was now part of a federal investigation into an art and antique theft ring that had been operating for several years. "Mrs. Dolores," Agent Brooks said, "we believe your daughter-in-law has been using your house as a command center for at least 3 years. We've identified connections to thefts in 6 different states." Agent Smith added, "What makes this case particularly interesting is that Cynthia developed a very sophisticated method. Instead of simply robbing random houses, she cultivated social relationships with wealthy families, studied their homes during social events, and then sold that information to professional thieves." "But how did she manage to keep all this a secret?" Louis asked. "Your wife is extremely intelligent," Agent Brooks explained. "She never participated directly in the physical robberies. Her role was that of an information gatherer and facilitator. She attended charity events, elegant dinners, art gallery openings, and memorized details about other families' homes and possessions." Agent Smith showed a folder full of photographs. We found hundreds of photos she had secretly taken during social events. Photos of paintings, sculptures, jewelry other women were wearing, even photos of security systems and house layouts. I looked at the photographs and recognized many of the houses. They were homes of families I knew, women I had interacted with at charity events for years. "Agent Brooks," I asked, "does this mean other families were also victimized by Cynthia?" "At least 12 families we've identified so far. The total value of the thefts we've connected to her operation exceeds $2 million. Louis looked completely devastated. "Agent Smith, what's going to happen to me? Are they going to think I was part of this?" "Mr. Louis, we've reviewed your financial records, your communications, your activity patterns. There is no evidence that you had knowledge of or participation in your wife's criminal activities. However, we need you to cooperate fully with our investigation." Agent Brooks looked directly at me. "Mrs. Dolores, is there anything else you need to know?" When we arrested Cynthia last night, she immediately began to negotiate. She's offering information about her entire criminal network in exchange for a reduced sentence. What kind of information? Names of all her accomplices, details about unsolved robberies, locations where stolen pieces are hidden. She's willing to turn over her entire organization to avoid spending 20 years in prison. Frank leaned forward. And what does that mean for Dolores? How long could Cynthia be in prison if she cooperates? If her testimony helps solve all related cases and leads to the arrest of the other members of the network, she could face between 5 and 8 years instead of 20 to 25. Lewis sighed deeply. So, even now, even after being arrested, Cynthia is finding ways to manipulate the system to benefit herself? That's how intelligent criminals work, Agent Smith explained. They always have an escape plan. After the FBI agents left, I sat in my living room trying to process everything I had learned. My house had been the center of a criminal operation for years. The woman who had made me feel invisible had been using my home to plan crimes against other families like mine. "Mom," Lewis said, sitting next to me, "how are we going to get through this? How am I going to rebuild my life after discovering that I've been married to a criminal for 10 years? I looked at my son, this 40-year-old man who suddenly looked like a lost child. "Lewis, what you're going to do is the same thing I'm going to do. You're going to decide that you're not going to let Cynthia define the rest of your life. She lied to you, she stole from me, and she used our family for her own criminal purposes. But now that we know the truth, we have the power to decide what to do with that information." "And what do you want to do, Mom?" I smiled, feeling a strength I hadn't experienced in years. "Son, I'm going to show the world exactly who Dolores really is, and I'm going to make sure no other family has to go through what we went through." The following days were a whirlwind of activity that completely transformed my life. Frank had organized a press conference where I would appear as the main victim of Cynthia's criminal scheme, but also as the woman who had managed to unmask the entire operation. For the first time in 10 years, I was going to be the center of attention for the right reasons. The morning of the press conference, I woke up early and dressed in my best emerald green dress, the one I had bought for my wedding anniversary with Mario, but had never worn because Cynthia always had sarcastic comments about my old-fashioned clothes. I put on the remaining jewelry from my collection, the pieces Cynthia hadn't managed to steal, and for the first time in a decade, I felt like the elegant and powerful woman I truly was. Lewis helped me get to the building where the conference would be held. "Mom," he said as we walked in, "I'm proud of you. I know these days have been terrible, but the way you've handled all this, Dad would be proud too." The room was full of journalists, television cameras, and curious onlookers who had come to hear the story of the millionaire elderly woman who caught her criminal daughter-in-law. When I entered the room, I could feel all eyes turning toward me, but this time they weren't looking at me with pity or condescension. They looked at me with respect, curiosity, even admiration. Frank approached the podium first. "Good morning. My name is Frank Miller, and I represent Mrs. Dolores, 71 years old, who was not only a victim of a criminal scheme run by her own daughter-in-law, but was also instrumental in unmasking a theft ring that had been operating for years." Then he invited me to speak. As I approached the microphone, I felt a strange calm. For 10 years, I had been silenced, ignored, treated as if my words had no value. Now, dozens of people were waiting to hear what I had to say. "My name is Dolores," I began, "and for the past 10 years, I was a victim of psychological abuse and systematic theft by my daughter-in-law, Cynthia. But what I want you to understand is that this is not just my story. It is the story of many elderly people who are victimized by family members who see them as easy targets." I continued telling my story, but not as a pathetic victim. I told it as a woman who had resisted, who had kept important secrets until the right moment, and who had finally found a way to obtain justice. "Cynthia thought I was a senile old woman who would never realize her crimes," I said. "But what she didn't know is that my late husband taught me to be observant, patient, and strategic. When I suspected something was wrong, I didn't confront directly. I investigated, collected evidence, and waited for the perfect moment to act. A journalist raised her hand. "Mrs. Dolores, why did you wait so long to act? Why didn't you report the thefts when they started?" "Because I needed enough evidence to ensure that Cynthia couldn't manipulate the situation," I replied. "People like my daughter-in-law are experts at making themselves look like victims. If I had acted too soon, with insufficient evidence, she would have found a way to convince everyone that I was a confused old woman making up stories." Another journalist asked how I felt, knowing that my house was used as a command center for a criminal network. I feel betrayed, of course, but I also feel powerful because in the end, it was I who put an end to that criminal operation. It was my report that led to the arrests. It was my evidence that unmasked the entire network. After the press conference, something extraordinary began to happen. My phone wouldn't stop ringing. Journalists from all over the country wanted to interview me. Documentary producers wanted to tell my story. But the calls that moved me most were from other elderly women who had seen the news and recognized elements of my story in their own lives. A woman named Diana called me crying. "Dolores, I saw your interview on television, and I think my son-in-law is stealing from me. My jewelry has been disappearing, but my daughter says it's normal for old people to lose things. After listening to you, I realize that maybe I'm not losing my memory." Another woman, Grace, told me that her daughter-in-law had been pressuring her to sign documents she didn't fully understand. "After seeing your story, I realized that I need to get my own lawyer, not rely on the lawyer my daughter-in-law recommends." These conversations made me understand that my experience with Cynthia was not unique. There were thousands of elderly people who were being victimized by family members who abused their trust, and many of them lacked the resources or knowledge to defend themselves. That night, Louis and I had a long and difficult conversation about our future. "Mom," he said, "I've decided to divorce Cynthia. I can't continue to be married to someone who hurt you so much and who turned out to be a criminal." "Are you sure, son? It's a very big decision." "Completely sure. For 10 years, I chose Cynthia over you, and that was the biggest mistake of my life. I'm not going to make the same mistake again." 3 days later, I received an unexpected call. It was a television producer named Peter who had seen my press conference. "Mrs. Dolores, I'd like to propose something to you. Have you considered having your own show where you help other elderly people who might be victimized by family members?" The idea intrigued me. What kind of show? A show where people can call in to tell their stories and where you can offer advice based on your experience. We could also have legal experts and psychologists to help. We'd call it Dolores's Wisdom or something like that. For the first time in my life, someone was offering me a platform to use my experience and knowledge to help others. For 71 years, I had been the devoted wife, the sacrificing mother, the invisible mother-in-law. Now I finally had the opportunity to be something more, an advocate, an educator, a voice for people who had been silenced like me. "Peter," I said, "I'm interested in your proposal, but I have some conditions." That night, as I prepared for bed in my house, for the first time in years without feeling like an intruder in my own home, I reflected on everything that had changed. A week ago, I was the invisible old woman everyone ignored. Now, I was a public figure whose story had inspired hundreds of people to examine their own family situations. My phone vibrated with a text message. It was from Frank. "Dolores, I just received news from the FBI. Thanks to your case and the information Cynthia is providing, they have arrested 6 more members of the criminal network. Your bravery not only saved you, it saved many other families from being victimized." I smiled as I turned off the light. Cynthia had spent 10 years trying to make me invisible, to convince me that I had no value, that I was too old and useless to matter. But in the end, it had been my strength, my patience, and my intelligence that had put an end to her reign of terror. The useless old woman had turned out to be much more powerful than anyone had imagined. 2 weeks after the press conference, my life had taken a turn I never could have imagined. The television show Dolores's Wisdom had become a national phenomenon. Every day, we received hundreds of calls from elderly people who had finally found the courage to tell their stories of family abuse and theft. Frank had officially established the Dolores Foundation for the Protection of Seniors with an initial donation of $200,000 from my secret inheritance. It was ironic. The money Cynthia had been planning to steal from me was now being used to protect other people from criminals like her. But the true satisfaction came when Patrick, my private detective, called me with extraordinary news. Dolores, Cynthia's testimony has been even more valuable than we expected. The FBI has managed to arrest the entire criminal network, 15 people in total, including the professional thieves, the corrupt appraisers who falsified valuations, and the art dealers who bought the stolen pieces. And what will happen to Cynthia? I asked. Here's the interesting part. Despite her cooperation, the judge decided that her crimes were too extensive for a reduced sentence. She's going to serve 12 years in federal prison, and when she gets out, she'll have to pay full restitution to all victims. 12 years. Cynthia, who had spent a decade making me feel invisible, would now be the one to disappear for more than a decade. But the story didn't end there. That same afternoon, I received a call that completely surprised me. Dolores, it's Cynthia. My heart raced. How are you calling from prison? They allowed me to make a call. Dolores, I need to talk to you. It's important. For 10 years, I had avoided direct confrontations with Cynthia, but now, with all the truth revealed and her in prison, I finally had the courage to listen to what she had to say. Speak, Cynthia. There was a long silence, and then I heard something I had never heard before. Cynthia crying. Not the manipulative tears she had used when she was arrested, but a genuine, desperate sob. Dolores, I need you to know something. When I started stealing from you, I really thought your things were worthless. But then, when I realized they were worth money, I couldn't stop. It was like an addiction. And that's supposed to justify 10 years of humiliations and thefts? No, it doesn't justify it. But I need you to understand that I never planned to go that far. At first, I just took a small brooch because we needed money for the vacation Louis wanted. When I sold it and no one noticed, I took something else and then another. I listened in silence as Cynthia continued her confession. Dolores, the truth is, I always envied you. You had this beautiful house. You had Mario's respect. You had a life that I wanted. And when I came into this family, I expected to be treated like a queen. But you were still the matriarch. I was just the son's wife. So you decided to make me the enemy. Yes, that's exactly what I did. And the more I humiliated you, the more powerful I felt. It was as if by making you small, I became bigger. It was the first time in 10 years that Cynthia had spoken to me with complete honesty. Cynthia, do you know what hurts me most about all of this? I asked her. What? That for 10 years, I really tried to connect with you. I tried to include you in family traditions, to teach you Mario's recipes, to share with you the memories of this house, and you took all of that and used it to hurt me. I know, she murmured. I know, and it's what hurts me most now. Dolores, in prison, I've had time to think, and I realized that I destroyed the only real family I had. My own parents abandoned me when I was a teenager. Your family was the only one that gave me a chance to belong to something. And you squandered it. I destroyed it. And not only that, I destroyed Louis, too. He called me yesterday to tell me that he had filed for divorce. She told me that he couldn't continue to be married to someone who hurt his mother so much. It was true. Louis had been completely transparent with me about his plans to divorce Cynthia. I can't continue pretending that my marriage can be saved after everything she did, he had told me. Cynthia, I said, why are you telling me all this? What do you want me to do with this information? I don't want you to do anything. I just wanted you to know that I realize what I lost. Not only did I lose my freedom, not only did I lose my marriage, I lost the opportunity to have a real family, to have a mother-in-law who truly cared about me. I did care about you, Cynthia. For years, I really tried to understand why you hated me so much. I didn't hate you. I envied you, and that envy turned me into a monster. I hung up the phone feeling a strange mix of emotions. I had waited 10 years to hear Cynthia admit the truth about her behavior, but now that she finally had, I didn't feel victorious. I felt sad for all the lost time, for all the wasted opportunities to have a united family. That night, Louis came to dinner with me. It was something we had started doing regularly since Cynthia's arrest. As we ate, I told him about the phone call. "Do you think Cynthia was being sincere?" he asked me. "I think she's finally facing the reality of her actions," I replied. "But Louis, what matters now isn't whether Cynthia finally understands what she did wrong. What matters is that we learn from this experience." "What do you mean?" "I mean that for 10 years, our family allowed a toxic person to control the entire family dynamic. Never again will I allow anyone to make me feel invisible in my own home, and I hope you never again allow anyone to mistreat the people you love." Louis nodded solemnly. "Mom, I've learned the hardest lesson of my life. Never again will I choose superficial peace over defending what is right." The next day, I received even better news. The Dolores Foundation had received an anonymous donation of $5 million from a wealthy family who had been saved from being victimized thanks to the information we had shared on our show. Frank explained to me, "Dolores, the Peterson family watched your show last week. Mrs. Peterson realized that her granddaughter had been exhibiting exactly the same behavior patterns as Cynthia, pressuring her to sign documents, suggesting she move to a retirement home, borrowing small pieces of jewelry. Thanks to your story, she hired a private detective and discovered that her granddaughter had been planning a scheme similar to Cynthia's, and they managed to stop her completely in time. The granddaughter has been arrested, and Mrs. Peterson recovered everything that had been stolen. She says your show saved not only her fortune, but probably her life." It was incredible to think that my story, my pain, had been transformed into something that could protect other families. Cynthia had spent 10 years trying to steal my worth and my dignity, but in the end, it had been that very experience that had given me a purpose greater than I had ever imagined. That night, as I prepared for sleep, I reflected on the extraordinary path my life had taken. A month ago, I was an invisible, elderly woman who felt useless in her own home. Now, I was a national advocate for senior rights, with a successful television show and a foundation that was saving families. Cynthia had tried to destroy me, but instead, she had awakened a strength I didn't even know I had. The sweetest revenge had not been seeing her go to prison. The sweetest revenge had been discovering exactly who I was when I finally had the courage to defend myself. 1 year after Cynthia's arrest, my life had transformed in ways I never could have imagined. The show Dolores' Wisdom had become the most watched television show in its time slot, broadcast in 32 different countries. The Dolores Foundation had helped more than 1,000 families identify and stop financial abuse schemes against elderly people. But the most important transformation was not public. It was personal. This morning, as I watered the flowers in the garden Mario and I had planted 40 years ago, I received a completely unexpected visit. Louis arrived, accompanied by an elegant woman in her 40s, with brown hair and a genuine smile that immediately reminded me of Mario's. "Mom," Louis said, clearly nervous, "I want to introduce you to someone very special. This is Nicole, and, well, we've been dating for the past 6 months." Nicole approached confidently, but also with respect. "Mrs. Dolores, I've heard so much about you. Louis has told me your whole story, and I must say you are an inspiration to women of all ages." The first thing I noticed about Nicole was how she looked at me with genuine respect, not with the condescension I had received from Cynthia for years. When she spoke to me, she addressed me directly, not Louis, as if I were invisible. "Nicole," I said, "what do you think of the fact that my son is dating you while he's still technically married?" Louis turned pale, but Nicole smiled. "Mrs. Dolores, I appreciate your direct question. Louis told me the entire situation with Cynthia before we started dating. The divorce papers were finalized last week. I would never have started a relationship with a married man, no matter the circumstances." I liked her honesty. "And what do you think about having a famous mother-in-law who appears on television talking about family problems?" Nicole laughed genuinely. "Honestly, I'm proud. You took a terrible experience and turned it into something that is helping thousands of people. That requires extraordinary strength." Over the next few months, I observed the relationship between Louis and Nicole. It was completely different from his marriage to Cynthia. Nicole encouraged Louis to spend time with me, to include me in their plans, to value my opinion. When they hosted dinners, they invited me as the matriarch of the family, not as a burden they had to tolerate. The most notable difference was that Nicole genuinely wanted to get to know me. She asked about my experiences with Mario, about the history of our house, about family traditions. Instead of trying to replace or erase the past, she wanted to be part of the continuity of our family. One afternoon, as Nicole and I were preparing dinner together, she asked me something that surprised me. "Mrs. Dolores, what can I do to make sure I never become someone like Cynthia?" I paused to think about her question. "Nicole, Cynthia became what she became because she saw our family as something she could exploit, not as something she could contribute to. You are already different because you care enough to ask the question. But I want to be specific. What behaviors should I avoid? Never try to isolate Louis from his family. Never speak ill of me when I'm not present. Never assume that because I'm older, my opinions don't matter. And if you ever have a problem with me, talk directly to me. Don't try to manipulate Louis to be your intermediary." Nicole nodded seriously. "And is there anything I can do proactively to be a good daughter-in-law?" "Recognize that this house, this family, has a history that existed before you arrived. Respect that history while contributing to creating new history, and never forget that being part of a family means giving as much as you receive." 6 months later, Louis asked me to go with him to buy an engagement ring for Nicole. It was ironic. It had all started with Cynthia stealing a $3 million ring, and now I was helping my son choose a ring to symbolize genuine love. "Mom," he said as we examined different options, "do you think I'm making the right decision? Do you think Nicole and I can build something lasting after everything that happened with Cynthia?" "Louis, the difference between Nicole and Cynthia is that Nicole sees our family as something valuable that she wants to protect. Cynthia saw our family as something she could exploit. That fundamental difference means everything." The proposal was perfect. Louis organized a dinner at our house, in the dining room where for years Cynthia had made me feel like an intruder. But this time, I was sitting at the head of the table, in my rightful place as matriarch of the family, while Louis proposed to Nicole. When Nicole said yes, the first thing she did was walk over to me and hug me. "Mrs. Dolores," she said with tears in her eyes, "I hope I can be the daughter-in-law you deserve." "Nicole," I replied, "you already are." The wedding day was the happiest family celebration we had had in over a decade. Nicole had insisted that the ceremony be held in our garden, honoring the legacy Mario and I had built. During the ceremony, Louis asked me to say a few words. "2 years ago," I began, "I believed my family story had ended with humiliation and betrayal. But today I understand that that terrible experience was simply the end of a chapter, not the end of the entire book. Nicole, welcome to a family that now knows how to value mutual respect, honesty, and genuine love." After the wedding, as the guests celebrated in the garden, I received an unexpected text message. It was from a woman named Karen who had watched my show from the beginning. "Dolores, I wanted you to know that your story gave me the courage to report my son, who had been stealing my medication to sell it. Thanks to your example, I regained my dignity and my health. Now, my son is in rehabilitation and our relationship is healing. Your courage inspired me to find mine." These messages arrived regularly. People from all over the world who had found the strength to defend their rights after hearing my story. It was proof that the pain I had suffered had been transformed into something positive and powerful. That night, after all the guests had left, I sat alone in my garden, reflecting on the extraordinary journey I had lived. 2 years ago, I was an invisible elderly woman, victimized by a daughter-in-law who saw me as a nuisance. Now, I was a national advocate, a woman with a new daughter-in-law who genuinely respected me, and the matriarch of a family rebuilt on foundations of honesty and love. My phone rang one last time. It was Frank. "Dolores, I have final news about Cynthia. Her appeal was just rejected. She's going to serve the full 12 years of her sentence." "And how do I feel about that?" I asked myself aloud. Only you can answer that question. The truth was, I no longer felt anger toward Cynthia. I felt pity for her. She had had the opportunity to be part of a genuine family, and she had squandered it for greed and envy. Now she would spend 12 years in prison while I enjoyed the new life I had built with my courage and determination. "Frank," I said, "Cynthia is no longer part of my story. My story now is about the thousands of families we've helped, about the new relationship I have with Louis, about the wonderful daughter-in-law I now have, and about the legacy I am building." After hanging up, I looked up at the stars and whispered, "Mario, I hope you're proud."